Dr. Thornton, we do appreciate you making yourself available to our audience tonight and helping us discuss the Confederacy in such a scholarly way, and save a drink for us when we get done. But
well, I certainly will. I do have to warn you, though, I am a Yankee originally.
Oh.
Well, if you're drinking a mint julep, that's good enough for me.
That'll do it. Well, Dr. Thornton, let us just start off with a kind of elementary question, and we'll work our way forward with regards to the inception of the war between the states. Was it Charleston or Lincoln's aggressive actions that provoked the war for Southern independence?
Well, as it comes down to history, basically it's the Southerners started the war by firing on, on the island in Charleston, South Carolina. But in fact, the Lincoln administration had actually engaged in several different aggressive acts, including sending federal soldiers into the state of Maryland and also sending reinforcements down to Charleston, South Carolina. So it's very often the case that the side that shoots the first shot is blamed for starting the war, but it's very often the case that it's really the other side who starts the war itself. And in this case, I think the aggressive behavior of the Lincoln administration was really the start of the war.
Well, with that being said, and I want to, we've spent so much time focusing on individual events and heroes of the Confederacy. I want to almost have an elementary discussion here at the beginning about the cause and effects of it all. Why did the South want to secede in the first place? Obviously, before the firing on Fort Sumter that April morning, there was already a lot of things in motion that had led the states to that point.
Well, of course, nowadays it's taught in high schools and colleges that slavery was the cause of the war, but that really wasn't the case at all back then. I mean, that's a historical artifact. In the 1860s, the South was really worried about the protectionism of the North and the Lincoln administration. The Lincoln administration, a Republican administration, was very protectionist. They wanted to impose large tariffs on imported goods. And the South was an exporter. The North was an industrial-based economy, and so the North would benefit from protectionism because that would advantage them vis-a-vis European imports of, steel and iron goods and cotton textiles and things of that nature. And so the North was pro-protectionism. They wanted high tariffs. They wanted to tax imports. And the South didn't want that because that meant that they would end up paying higher prices for all of the goods that they consumed, and there would be less money to buy their imports. And so it would be a tremendous disadvantage for the South to have protectionism in the form of higher taxes on imports, and it would be a tremendous advantage to northern industries and northern industrial labor to have these taxes. And so the nation was divided in terms of tariffs and protectionism. It was almost universal. There were pockets of, differences. Nashville, for example, was pro-protectionism because they had an industrial economy. Richmond as well. And there were things in the North that were anti-tariffs and protectionism. But basically the country was divided, North and South, on the basis of protectionism and tariffs. And that was the ultimate, really, the real cause of the Civil War. That was the dividing line in Congress and the Senate.
So at the root of all of this, that which predicated this war was that which begins most wars, money and economics. Is that what you're saying? Is that what drove the Union to try to keep the South as a part of the United States?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's absolutely no question about it. If you look at the newspapers, if you look at the dialogues, if you look at the congressional papers, there's no question that that was the major issue that divided the North and the South. Economics, money, it was the major issue basically between the North and the South. And we see this Also in the European sector, I mean, if we look at the newspaper ads the newspaper columns in Europe, who were basically disinterested in all this, they realized full well that it was a matter of protectionism, and that America had moved gradually over time from the Constitution to the Civil War to a more free trade status. And that was the whole issue from the Constitution to the Civil War of protectionism. What was the tariff rates going to be? And we had whittled our way down to a very low tariff, about 20%. And we were, funding government with that tariff, and we were doing very well. Actually, the economy of the 1850s was booming as a result of all that. But Northerners felt that they were disadvantaged by all this. They knew that if they could get tariffs on steel imports, that people in Pennsylvania would benefit from all that. They knew that if they could get tariffs on other goods, cotton textiles and so forth, that people in Massachusetts would do very well because they were also competing in textiles. So that was really the whole ball of wax as far as what people were concerned about, what people were writing about in the newspapers, what they were talking about in the saloons and in the public square. That was the main issue of the day.
So obviously the North had great benefits in imposing these tariffs on the South, and it seems as though the South was getting nothing in return. So what was the impact of the Union blockade on the Confederacy?
Well, that's your first part of the question is actually very important, because not only would the North benefit from the tariffs itself in terms of the terms of trade, but the money that came in from the tariffs was mostly spent in the North in terms of building military fortifications and government buildings and so on and so forth. Most of the money that came in was actually spent in the North, so they benefited tremendously as a result of the tariffs. They got better terms of trade in international trade, and the federal government revenue was mostly spent between Washington, D.C. and Boston, Massachusetts, and very little of it was spent in the South. And so they got a good bang for the buck in terms of those tariffs.
And it served to usurp the economic strength as well as the political strength of the South in doing this as well. Wouldn't you agree?
I would definitely agree with that. Yes, absolutely. And in terms of the blockade, of course, this was what we argue in our book, The Economics of the Civil War, Tariffs, Blockades, and Inflation, is that the blockade was the main issue in the war. And the blockade, in terms of cutting off trade between the South and Europe and other island, areas around the South, was the real dividing line in terms of the Civil War. The South depended upon international trade more than possibly any other region in the world has ever depended upon international trade, because basically it produced a few staple goods like cotton, tobacco, sugar, and a few other products, and everything else, clothing, medicine, food of various sorts, any kind of mechanical device, it relied upon world trade. And when the Union blockade went into effect, it was very detrimental to the Southern economy and the Southern people, and that's one of the reasons why a lot of international organizations think that blockades are illegal in terms of the international legal code.
Well, with that blockade, it could be argued that that's where the South actually lost.
So that was actually my next question, Jess. I appreciate you segueing into that. That was actually right next on my notes, and I know you didn't look, so you couldn't have known that. But, Dr. Thornton, that's the million-dollar question. Did this economic terrorism, so to speak, did that play a role in the eventual defeat of the South?
It's actually the main issue of the Civil War. If you look at the thousands of books and articles that have been written about the Civil War, they all emphasize the land battle between the North and the South. They all emphasize, the strategy, the great Robert E. Lee and the Union generals and so on and so forth. But they're actually missing the entire point, because all of the Northern and Southern generals and officers were basically all trained at West Point. They all had the same strategy. They all basically had the same weapons. They all basically, were equal in size and strength. The South had the advantage in terms of being on the defensive. The North had the advantage in terms of being a larger economy. The real difference in this war was the battle at sea. And nobody really emphasizes this except in our book, where the sea battle, the battle between the blockade runners and the blockaders themselves, were really the deciding factor. And here you have a battle. It's very interesting because the blockade runners really had no guns and cannons to defend themselves. They were running products into the South and cotton out of the South. And the other side, the blockaders, the Union blockade fleet, they really didn't want to hurt their enemies. They didn't really want to sink those ships because their pay was based on capturing those ships. And so they were like entrepreneurs. They were like military entrepreneurs. They wanted to stop those ships, capture those ships, sell those ships and its cargo, and reap the benefits. And so it was like a grand economic battle on the sea. And ultimately the Union won that battle, but they shouldn't have. The logic of the situation should have led the Confederacy in the South to win that economic battle, but ultimately they didn't.
Well, here's a related question, I think, and it's a question that I haven't heard answered before, with regards to the economics of the Civil War. And as you're articulating here, and something that I believe, this was the greatest detriment to the South. But why did the South inflate their currency to the degree that it did when it was seceding, and how does that affect our policy today, or does it affect our policy today?
Well, unfortunately, the South undertook a military strategy, which was a big government centralized operation. They basically, they were all trained at West Point. President Davis was Secretary of Defense, actually Secretary of War back then, as it was more aptly called. And so they all had the big government standing army mentality. And in order to finance a big standing army, you had to raise a lot of revenue. And so they resulted to inflation on a major scale. Instead of relying on a guerrilla warfare tactic in which basically the people who were fighting the war provided their own guns, provided their own ammunition, provided their own uniform, in the sense that they really didn't have a uniform, and they basically went out and shot whoever anybody came into town who was an opponent. And the big centralized army system requires that the central government raise tons of revenue, purchase, tons of weapons, ammunition, and so on and so forth. And as a result, in the Confederacy, they paid for all of that with inflation. They printed up the money. They ran up a large national debt. And basically that has the effect of ruining the Southern economy. And the North relied on inflation and national debt, but to a much lesser degree. And as a result, the effect of all that inflation, the effect of all that government borrowing on the South really crushed the Southern economy. It made the Southern economy very, very unproductive. And if the Southern economy is very unproductive, it cannot sustain itself. And that's what we saw at the end of the Civil War was basically the Southern economy had been ground into the dirt by government policy, as well, of course, as the Union Army, destructing the capital structure of the Southern economy. So basically, they took the wrong strategy. If they had followed their forefathers of the American Revolution and relied more on a guerrilla-type warfare where your government army is basically running away from the enemy. George Washington, his strength was simply running away from the enemy and then letting the guerrillas pick off the enemy one by one. I think the South would have created a stalemate.
Well, certainly that was something that I would have liked to have seen done, and it's just exciting to hear such a historically accurate analysis of these issues, the cause and effects of it all. As you said, so often is the case when we don't talk about the economics of war, when truth be known, that is the most important, if not the sole reason wars are fought. But before we run out of time, you mentioned this earlier in the program, and we're talking about issues that did play a role in the war between the states and the war of northern aggression, whatever you want to call it. But let's talk about issues that really didn't, and that being slavery. How truly big was the issue of slavery, and why is it a myth that just doesn't go away? Now we're taught politically correct. Political correctness teaches us that it was all because of slavery and the good-heartedness of Abraham Lincoln to free the poor, downtrodden Southern blacks that the war was fought. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, I can tell you one thing, that slavery did not cause the Civil War, and that the Republican Party and Abraham Lincoln were not big advocates of abolitionism. Of course, I am, and I believe that any form of slavery, whether it's actual slavery or tax slavery or whatever it happens to be, I'm absolutely against it. But I don't really think it played much of a role in getting this war started. And 25 years ago, I took a course in the history of the Civil War, and slavery was one of 7 different issues that supposedly caused the Civil War. And it was only a cause in the sense that it divided political parties. It wasn't really a matter of abolition at all. And Abraham Lincoln was not really an advocate of abolition. He wanted to export the slaves back to Africa. So there's no reason to suspect that slavery was the cause of the war. It was protectionism, and the historical record basically vindicates that explanation. Of course, the abolition of slavery is the silver lining of the Civil War. 300,000 soldiers died in this conflict. Untold civilians died, were injured, were mentally devastated as a result of the Civil War. Whole regions of this country were flattened and devastated. And that's all to the bad. But the one silver lining of the war, and it wasn't really an unintended consequence, was that the slaves were freed. And, most of the people back then, after the Civil War, whether they were white or black, Southern or Northern, all thought that freedom for the slaves would end up with the extermination of the race. They didn't think that black people could survive in freedom. And what we ultimately found out was that without any support from the federal government, without any redistribution of wealth, without any federal program to support these former slaves, that they actually did quite nice for themselves, and they progressed actually more rapidly than the white population after the Civil War. So that whole story, the whole story of slavery in the Civil War, is actually backward of the historical truth. The war was not fought for black Americans. Fortunately, they were freed as a result of the war, and they survived and they thrived in the absence of any help whatsoever from the federal government.
And of course, contrast that with what happened in the 1960s, and then, well, that's a whole other show. But, ladies and gentlemen, our guest this evening has been Dr. Mark Thornton, and Ph.D. in economics from Auburn University. He is a member, senior fellow, I should say, of the Mises Institute. Before you go, Dr. Thornton, tell us about the Mises Institute and how we can get more information about it.
We're at www.mises.org, and we have the most trafficked economic website in the world, and we are one of the more radical free market think tanks in the world, and we invite you to come to our website. Everything is downloadable for free. We have dozens of books, articles, journals, newsletters, daily articles, and I think you'll learn a lot, and you'll see a very different perspective on the world once you come to see us.
Well, folks, we encourage you to check that out. And Dr. Thornton, we thank you for making yourself available on the Political Cesspool this evening as we round out Confederate History Month. Thank you again.
Thank you.